Deputy Travis Maddox raised his fist against a black woman and everything changed. He thought she was nobody. He thought he could beat her down, arrest her, and walk away without consequences, just like he always had. What Maddox didn't know was that the woman he assaulted wasn't a clerk or a name he could bury under paperwork. She was Judge Camille Rivers, and she wasn't about to be silenced. Maddox thought his badge would protect him. He thought the system would cover for him one more time. But this time, he picked the wrong woman. Because Camille Rivers isn't just fighting for herself. She's about to tear down everything that protected him. And nothing is going to stop her. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning buzzed with a familiar kind of tension, the kind that seeped through the courthouse halls like a low electric current, steady and almost invisible, but always there if you knew how to feel for it. Attorneys brushed past one another, their arms cradling thick files and briefcases, their phones pressed to their ears, murmuring last-minute arguments or hurried updates to impatient clients. Witnesses sat hunched on hard wooden benches, wringing their hands or stealing anxious glances at the heavy doors that led into worlds they barely understood. Security officers in dull gray uniforms moved along the walls like restless currents themselves, weaving through the throng, eyes always searching, always calculating. Camille Rivers slipped into that flow without slowing, her black blazer sharp against the muted colors around her, her dark hair pulled neatly back, a slim briefcase swinging easily at her side. She was without her robe, without the obvious marker that usually parted the crowds before her like a tide, and in that moment, she moved among them not as the federal judge presiding over the courthouse's most important docket, but as just another professional making her way to wherever the day demanded. She preferred it that way when she could get it, a moment to observe the world as it was, unfiltered by titles or whispered warnings. Her heels clicked steadily against the polished floor, each step measured, unhurried, as she passed the metal detectors and security stations with barely a nod to the deputies who barely glanced up from their conversations. None of them recognized her, and she didn't offer them any reason to. She had a hearing in courtroom 12B, an evidentiary matter that promised to be tedious but important, and she wanted to be there early, to review the last-minute filings that had come in overnight. She thought of the towering stack of motions awaiting her, of the defendant who had filed a new complaint alleging racial discrimination during his arrest, and she felt the familiar weight settle across her shoulders, not heavy enough to slow her, but present. Like an old companion, she no longer tried to shake. The elevator banks rose ahead of her, a row of polished silver doors that gleamed under the courthouse's harsh fluorescent lights. She adjusted the briefcase in her hand and angled toward them, weaving through a knot of paralegals who barely noticed her passing. The crowd thinned closer to the elevators, where a few groups lingered, murmuring quietly. The tension thicker here as attorneys rehearsed their arguments or nervously scanned their notes. Camille's gaze was steady, her path straight, until a figure shifted abruptly into it, blocking her just before she reached the call button. He was tall, thick in the shoulders, wearing the brownish-gray uniform of courthouse security, the badge on his chest gleaming brighter than it needed to. His stance was casual, almost lazy, but there was nothing relaxed about the way he planted his feet wide, his arms folding slowly across his chest as he took her in with a look that had stopped hundreds of people before her, a look that said he saw something he didn't like and intended to make sure they knew it. Camille slowed without hesitation, her face unreadable, her hands loose at her sides, but her heart flickered once in quiet recognition. She had seen this performance before. A man who believed his badge gave him the right to gatekeep public space, to decide who belonged and who didn't, based on little more than the color of their skin or the cut of their suit. The deputy's name, stitched neatly above his badge, read Maddox, though she didn't need to know it to understand everything she needed about him in that moment. For a brief second, the air around them seemed to tighten, the murmur of the courthouse receding as if the building itself was pausing to see what would happen next. Camille felt the shift, acknowledged it silently, and kept walking, closing the last few steps between them with the same steady pace she had carried through the front doors, offering him no sign that she was the least bit concerned with whatever silent test he thought he was setting. And when she stopped before him, leaving only a thin breath of space between them, she lifted her chin just slightly, her voice calm, cool, and unmistakably commanding as she said, "Excuse me. Could you move aside?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain herself. She simply gave an order, the same way she would from the bench, expecting it to be followed. But Travis Maddox didn't move, not an inch. Instead, he shifted his weight forward just enough that the intention was clear, letting the silence between them stretch long enough to draw the attention of the nearest witnesses, a few attorneys pausing mid-conversation to glance over, sensing the disturbance blooming at the edge of their morning routines. Maddox's lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the casual cruelty of a man used to getting his way without needing to shout. "And just where exactly do you think you're going?" Camille held his gaze without blinking, feeling the weight of his posture, the challenge in it, but refusing to yield even an inch. Around them, the muted hum of courthouse life continued, but the space between them felt insulated, sealed off from the rest of the world by an invisible boundary that neither was willing to cross first. She had seen men like him before, men who mistook their uniform for authority, and their authority for superiority, who expected deference as their due, and viewed anything less as a personal insult. Her voice, when it came, was steady and even, slicing cleanly through the charged air. "I don't think my destination is any of your concern," she said, shifting the briefcase to her other hand, ready to step around him if necessary, though she already knew he wouldn't make it that easy. Maddox's mouth twitched again, that half-formed sneer never quite settling into a full expression, and for a moment he said nothing, letting the tension coil tighter between them like a rope slowly winding toward a breaking point. Then, as if granting her a favor, he unfolded his arms and leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low enough that only she and a few of the closest bystanders could hear it. "Funny," he said, dragging the word out like a slow insult. "You people always think you can just wander wherever you want, like you own the place." The words hit not with shock, but with a grim, weary familiarity, the kind that didn't sting so much as settle, heavy and bitter, on old wounds too often ignored. Camille's spine straightened subtly, her shoulders tightening beneath her jacket, but outwardly she remained as still as a stone, her face giving nothing away. For a beat, she considered the easier path, the one where she swallowed the slight, offered some neutral explanation, kept moving without making a scene. But that instinct, long practiced and carefully honed, flickered and died before it could fully take hold. Today, here, in this building where she had spent years upholding the dignity of the law for others, she would not shrink herself to appease the smallness of a man like Travis Maddox. "I suggest you reconsider your tone," Camille said, her voice cutting sharper now, not loud, but carrying enough force that a few more heads turned toward them, subtle shifts of bodies indicating that people were beginning to listen. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. Maddox's jaw tightened, the muscle flexing beneath his skin, and for the first time, a flicker of something almost like uncertainty passed through his eyes, a faint, fleeting recognition that perhaps he had misjudged the situation, that the woman standing before him was not as powerless as he had assumed, but pride, heavy and stubborn, crushed whatever instinct for caution might have stirred in him. He stepped closer instead, closing the scant distance between them until his badge was nearly brushing her blazer, a move meant to intimidate, to remind her, and everyone watching, who he thought held the power here. "You don't tell me how to talk," he said, louder now, his voice sharp enough to slice through the conversations humming along the hallway, drawing a few curious glances from the attorneys gathered near the elevators. "You answer my questions, or you turn yourself around." The moment stretched, taut and trembling with possibility, and Camille knew with absolute certainty that any move she made now would be seen not as a choice, but as a challenge. She could feel it in the way his hand hovered near his belt, not yet touching the baton or the handcuffs hanging there, but close enough to make a point. She shifted slightly to her right, angling as if to step past him, her movement deliberate but unhurried, a refusal to be rushed or corralled like an unruly child. But Maddox shifted with her, a half step to block her path again, and in the narrow space between them, the inevitable happened. Her briefcase brushed against his side, and as she adjusted her footing to avoid stepping on him, her heel clipped the edge of his boot, sending her stumbling lightly into his chest. It was not a hard impact, barely more than a nudge, the kind of incidental contact that happened dozens of times a day in crowded public spaces, easily ignored by anyone not looking for an excuse. But Maddox seized on it like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. He staggered back a full step, exaggerating the movement, drawing a sharp intake of breath as if he had been assaulted. His hand dropped to the baton at his hip, his posture rigid with manufactured outrage. "You just assaulted a court officer," he barked, his voice rising to a volume that sliced clean across the floor, freezing conversations and turning heads. "Hands where I can see them!" A ripple of confusion and concern spread outward from them as people shifted and craned to see what was happening, the sudden spectacle pulling more attention with every second that passed. Camille stood very still, her hands loose at her sides, her jaw tight but her expression calm, refusing to give him the scene he clearly craved. "You know that's not what happened," she said, her voice low but firm enough that those nearest could hear, could register the calm clarity of it against the bluster and fury Maddox radiated. But Maddox, already committed to his performance, advanced on her again, the baton now unhooked from his belt, swinging loosely in one hand as if daring her to resist. "You think you're special?" he hissed, leaning close enough that she could see the flush creeping up his neck, the raw fury ignited by the simple fact of her defiance. "You think you're better than the rest of them?" Camille didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She stood her ground with a stillness so complete it seemed to radiate outward, anchoring her even as the situation spiraled around them. "I suggest you reconsider your next move," she said quietly, her voice carrying enough finality to cut through the anger roaring behind his eyes. But Maddox wasn't listening anymore. He had already decided how this would end, and no amount of warning would change the path he had chosen. The courthouse floor seemed to hold its breath, the usual rhythm of footsteps and murmured conversations thinning into a low, uncertain hum that hovered just out of reach. More people had gathered now, drawn by the sharp rise and fall of Maddox's voice, by the unmistakable scent of something going wrong in a place where order was supposed to reign. Attorneys clutched their files a little tighter, glancing uneasily at one another, some edging backward toward the safer shadows of doorways, others standing still, frozen by the collision unfolding before them. Camille felt the weight of those eyes on her, the gathering curiosity, the flicker of fear, the question of whether they would intervene if things went worse. She did not expect them to, not because they were cowards, though some surely were, but because she understood better than most how deeply the instincts of self-preservation ran when authority began to bare its teeth. Maddox stood in front of her like a wall, radiating hostility so thick it seemed to bend the air around him. His hand tightened on the baton, knuckles whitening, the weapon hanging at his side with a casualness that made it all the more threatening. He was waiting for something, anything, that would give him an excuse to escalate further, and Camille knew that even breathing wrong might be enough. She kept her voice level, threading it carefully between defiance and restraint. "You're making a mistake," she said, her gaze steady, refusing to drop to the baton or to the badge he wore like armor against accountability. Maddox laughed, a short, ugly sound that seemed to rattle against the marble walls. "I don't take orders from you," he said, each word clipped, sharp enough to cut. "You think a fancy outfit and a pretty voice mean you can walk around here like you're somebody?" The implication dripped from every syllable, and Camille caught the subtle shift among the onlookers, a collective flinch at the nakedness of his disdain, at the way he stripped away even the thin veneer of professionalism most officers maintained. He didn't see her as a lawyer or a judge or anything else that might command basic respect. He saw only what he wanted to see: a black woman out of place, daring to move through the world without fear. And for men like Travis Maddox, that alone was provocation enough. "You don't know who I am," Camille said quietly, not as a threat, not as a boast, but as a simple, unassailable fact. Maddox stepped closer, his breath hot and sour with anger, his shoulders squared, as if he intended to physically drive her backward with the sheer force of his presence. "I know exactly what you are," he sneered, loud enough now that the words bounced off the polished stone and echoed back to them, too. "Another mouthy nobody who thinks the rules don't apply." The knot of spectators had thickened, a rough semicircle forming at a cautious distance, their faces a blend of shock, fascination, and something harder to name: the uneasy thrill of witnessing a line being crossed in real time, knowing they could not look away, and would later pretend they hadn't seen. A few pulled out their phones, hesitating, unsure whether recording would help or hurt, the devices hanging limply in their hands, like lifelines they were too afraid to grab. Camille shifted her stance slightly, planting her feet more firmly, her body language a silent refusal to retreat. The slight movement caught Maddox's eye, and he pounced on it, like a wolf scenting blood. "Resisting a court officer!" he barked, loud enough that his voice cracked with the effort, drawing even more attention. "You're under arrest!" The words rang absurdly in the air, suspended for a moment in a kind of disbelief that no one dared to puncture. Camille did not move. She didn't raise her hands, didn't turn to flee, didn't offer the kind of resistance he so clearly craved. She simply stood there, steady as a stone against a rising tide. "You need to stop," she said, her voice low and cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You're making this worse for yourself." But Maddox was too far gone to hear reason, his mind already locked into the narrative he had decided upon, that she was a threat, a problem, a danger to be neutralized, regardless of what reality might suggest. He advanced again, swinging his baton loosely in one hand like a warning, while his other hand hovered near his radio, fingers twitching as if preparing to call for backup. In the shuffle of his aggressive posturing, his boot scuffed sharply against the floor, and in the confined space between them, the movement brushed hard against Camille's foot. The contact more than incidental this time, deliberate, meant to jostle her, to force a reaction he could use as justification. Camille caught her balance quickly, not stumbling this time, but the physical encroachment lit a fire beneath the crowd, the murmur rising into gasps and low protests, a few voices calling out warnings or snapping at Maddox to back off. But he ignored them, eyes fixed solely on Camille, blind to everything else now except his own spiraling rage. "You people," he spat, the words thick with hatred, "think you're untouchable." And without warning, he closed the final distance between them. His free hand shot out, grabbing Camille roughly by the upper arm, yanking her forward hard enough that her briefcase slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a hollow, echoing thud. Camille twisted sharply, wrenching her arm from his grip, the motion clean, controlled, driven not by panic, but by the simple demand to reclaim her space, her dignity, her right to stand unmolested in a building dedicated, at least in theory, to justice. The crowd surged closer, the noise swelling, phones now firmly lifted, recording every furious second. But Maddox had committed himself too fully to see or care. He stumbled back a half step, shock flashing across his face at the defiance, and then his expression twisted, ugly and mean, as his fists clenched and rose. For one long, suspended moment, Camille saw it coming. Not in flashes or fragments, but with perfect, brutal clarity. The punch drawn back, the fury burning through his skin, the inevitability of the blow written in every trembling muscle of his body. And then it landed, hard, across her face. The sound of it cracked through the hallway like a gunshot, and the world fractured. Camille's head snapped to the side under the force of it, her body staggering 2 steps before she caught herself, one hand reflexively reaching out to the cold, unyielding marble wall for support. Pain bloomed sharp and immediate across her cheekbone, hot and blinding, but deeper than that was the quiet, bone-deep outrage. The knowledge that this was not just an attack on her body, but on everything she represented. And she would not let it stand. The hallway erupted into chaos. Shouts, screams, the clatter of dropped files and frantic footsteps filled the space as attorneys, clerks, and witnesses scrambled, some ducking back toward the elevators, others pressing closer, torn between horror and the instinct to witness what could no longer be denied. Maddox lunged forward, grabbing Camille's wrist roughly as if to cuff her, shouting something about resisting, about non-compliance, his voice a hoarse, incoherent roar that made less and less sense the longer it went on. Camille, bleeding but unbowed, straightened to her full height, her eyes locking onto his with a cold fury that made him falter for the first time. And from somewhere beyond the noise, a voice rang out, clear and commanding, cutting through the confusion like a siren. "That's Judge Rivers. You just assaulted a sitting federal judge." For the first time, doubt flickered across Maddox's face, confusion flashing in his eyes as he tightened his grip on Camille's wrist, as if trying to hold on to the narrative slipping from his fingers. But it was already too late. The crowd knew, the courthouse knew, and soon the entire system he trusted to shield him would know too. Maddox froze, his hand still clamped around Camille's wrist, blinking once, twice, as if the words themselves were too foreign to register. "No," he said. The denial half-formed, almost childlike in its refusal. "No, she's lying. She's not." But even as he said it, heads were nodding, voices rising in affirmation. "That's her," someone said. "I've seen her in court," another voice added. "She's the federal judge assigned to the Lawson case," someone else confirmed, the words slicing through Maddox's defenses with a precision he could neither dodge nor deny. The realization washed over him visibly, draining the blood from his face, tightening the lines around his mouth until they carved deep, angry grooves into his skin. His fingers twitched against Camille's wrist, as if unsure whether to release her or hold on tighter. Trapped in the no-man's land between authority and panic, Camille, sensing the shift, finally moved, not to flee or retaliate, but simply to straighten herself, reclaiming her space, her power, her dignity without force or apology. "You assaulted a sitting federal judge," she said, her voice cool and sharp as glass, her words falling into the stunned silence like stones into still water. "Release me, now." For one heart-thudding beat, Maddox hesitated, his breathing loud in his own ears, the weight of the witnesses around him pressing heavier with every second that passed. Then, almost as if his body betrayed him, his grip loosened, fingers slipping away from Camille's wrist as he stumbled back a half-step, his mouth opening and closing uselessly. The opening was enough. Camille stepped away from him, her movement smooth and unhurried, turning slightly to address the nearest uniformed deputy, a younger man whose wide eyes flicked nervously between her and Maddox. "You," she said, pointing not with a shaking hand, but with the precise authority that left no room for doubt. "Take him into custody, now." The young deputy hesitated for only a second, glancing at his colleagues, at the recording phones, at the blood staining Camille's lip, before nodding stiffly and stepping forward. Maddox's head snapped toward him in disbelief, the full reality of the moment slamming into him at last. "You can't arrest me!" he barked, backing up quickly, one hand raised as if warding off an unseen blow. "I'm the officer here. She attacked me. She assaulted—" "No," Camille said, her voice slicing cleanly through his protests, commanding the space with a presence that no uniform or badge could countermand. "You assaulted me, in full view of dozens of witnesses, and now you will answer for it." The young deputy, joined by two more from the far side of the hall, moved in cautiously, hands reaching for Maddox's arms, speaking to him in calm, clipped tones that he refused to hear. Maddox jerked away, twisting and shouting, his face mottled with rage and panic, his words devolving into a chaotic mess of protests and accusations that only underscored his guilt. "Get your hands off me!" he bellowed, as the deputies seized his arms, forcing them behind his back. "This is a setup! She's lying! They're all lying!" The cuffs snapped around his wrists with a final echoing click that silenced the last of the murmurs around them, and Maddox sagged between the two deputies, his face twisted in furious disbelief. He was still shouting as they hauled him toward the elevators, but his words were lost under the rising roar of public attention, under the inevitable weight of a system that, for once, would not shield him. Camille watched them go, the ache in her face throbbing in time with her heartbeat, but she refused to reach for it, refused to give any sign of weakness now. She turned instead to the gathered crowd, scanning their faces, seeing the phones still raised, the attorneys who would soon be deposed as witnesses, the clerks who would tell the story again and again until it could no longer be ignored or spun away. She straightened her jacket with a slow, deliberate movement, the simple act as powerful as any speech, then bent to retrieve her briefcase from where it had fallen, lifting it with care as if restoring a sacred object to its rightful place. There would be fallout, there would be backlash, but there would also be justice, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been brushed aside, silenced, or brutalized by men like Travis Maddox. And Camille Rivers, bloodied but unbroken, would be the one to see it through. The last echoes of Maddox's shouting faded down the hallway, swallowed by the heavy slam of the service elevator doors as they closed behind him, sealing him off from the courthouse floor he had once prowled so confidently. The crowd, still thick around Camille, stood stunned in the aftermath, the hum of nervous energy hanging in the air like the residue of a storm that had not yet finished shaking the ground beneath them. For a moment, no one moved, as if uncertain whether the world had truly shifted so violently or if it might yet snap back into the old, familiar order where men like Maddox barked commands and others obeyed without question. Camille knew that silence well, had heard it in courtrooms after unexpected rulings, had felt it in meetings where unspoken biases weighed heavier than words. But here, now, it rang differently. It rang with a waiting she intended to answer. Slowly, she stepped forward, her every movement deliberate, anchoring herself deeper into the space Maddox had tried so violently to force her from. She turned toward the cluster of deputies still lingering nearby, most of them young, wide-eyed, clearly rattled by what they had just witnessed, and she addressed them with the calm, unassailable authority that no badge or uniform could ever counterfeit. "I want security to secure the camera footage from all the angles covering this hall," she said, her voice clear enough that it carried without needing to rise. "Effective immediately. No one touches it. No one edits it. I want it preserved in full." The young deputy who had first moved to cuff Maddox, DeWitt, according to the tag clipped to his belt, nodded quickly, a sharp, almost frightened motion, and fumbled for his radio to start issuing the necessary orders. His voice crackled over the channel, summoning supervisors, confirming that the footage would be locked, that chain of custody protocols would be followed precisely. Camille listened without comment, reading the tension in his posture, the anxious glances exchanged among the remaining officers. They were scared, not of her, but of the weight now hanging over all of them. The knowledge that they were witnesses to a career-ending disaster, one that would not be buried or quietly dismissed. She intended to make sure of that. She shifted her attention to the attorneys and clerks who had clustered closer now, some murmuring among themselves, others still clutching their phones like lifelines. Michael Bennett, face pale but steady, stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone meant for private counsel, though they both knew privacy no longer existed in this moment. "I've got it all," he said, tapping his phone lightly against his palm. "Video, audio, everything from the moment he stepped in your way." "Good," Camille said, allowing the smallest nod of acknowledgement. "Make sure you keep an original copy, and if anyone from security tries to confiscate it before my office makes a formal request, you call me directly." Bennett nodded, the look they exchanged brief but heavy with understanding. This wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun. Around them, courthouse security supervisors began arriving. Older men in pressed uniforms, their faces tight with the knowledge that they were walking into a situation already spinning beyond their control. One of them, a captain whose name Camille remembered only vaguely from a previous briefing, approached with cautious steps, hands held slightly out from his sides in a show of harmlessness that did little to hide the anxiety threading through his voice. "Judge Rivers," he began, his tone measured, almost pleading. "I'm Captain Wilcox. I want to personally apologize." "This isn't the time for apologies," Camille cut in smoothly, not unkind but firm enough that he stopped mid-sentence. "This is the time for protocols. I expect full cooperation, full transparency. Every second of footage, every witness statement, every internal report. Nothing disappears. Nothing gets buried." Wilcox nodded quickly, bobbing his head like a man drowning who had finally found something solid to hold on to. "Of course, Your Honor," he said, his voice rough with nerves. "Full cooperation. I'll oversee it myself." Camille regarded him for a moment longer, reading the sincerity there. Real or manufactured, it no longer mattered. She would hold them all to their word, and she would do it under the bright, inescapable light of public scrutiny. No private apologies whispered behind closed doors would erase what had happened here today. Only action would. Only consequences. She turned back to the wider crowd, feeling the buzz of whispered conversations pressing at the edges of the hall. She could already sense the shape of the narrative forming. A federal judge assaulted in her own courthouse, a white officer's rage boiling over in a place built to uphold the law, and she knew better than to trust the system to tell the story accurately without her hand firmly on the reins. "Those of you who witnessed the assault," she said, her voice carrying easily across the wide marble floor, "you will be contacted by my office. I expect you to provide full statements. If anyone attempts to intimidate or influence you, you are to notify me immediately." There was a shifting in the crowd, some heads ducking, some nodding, a few faces lighting with cautious resolve. Camille let them see her. Let them see the blood still crusting at the corner of her mouth, the calm steel in her gaze, the absolute refusal to allow this to be swept into quiet injustice. Finally, with the situation stabilized, she turned and began walking steadily toward the internal elevators reserved for judges and senior court staff. The crowd parted before her, not in fear, but in something heavier, something earned, respect, or at least the beginnings of it. Behind her, Captain Wilcox barked quiet orders into his radio. Security officers scrambled to lock down the surveillance servers, and attorneys pulled their colleagues aside to retell the story, already growing larger with every repetition. Camille entered the elevator alone, the doors sliding shut with a smooth whisper that sealed her away from the lingering stares and murmured questions. She reached for the panel, her finger hovering over the floor selection, then paused, her reflection catching her eye in the polished metal. The woman looking back at her bore the fresh mark of violence across her face, but her gaze was steady, her jaw set in a line of unflinching resolve. This was not over. It was barely beginning. Camille selected her floor, the elevator humming to life beneath her feet, carrying her upward, not just through the courthouse she had long served, but toward a reckoning that would leave no corner of it untouched. She would not simply survive this, she would set it right. And Travis Maddox, and all who protected him, would answer for it. The sterile white walls of the hospital examination room felt closer than they should have. The ceiling lights buzzing faintly overhead, the air conditioned so aggressively it seemed to leach warmth from Camille's skin, even through her jacket. She sat on the edge of the examination table, her back straight, despite the dull throb pulsing along her jaw, and the slight swelling that had begun to darken one side of her face into a slow, angry bruise. The nurse who had cleaned the split at the corner of her lip had offered polite, murmured condolences, careful not to meet her eyes for too long, careful not to say anything that might break whatever fragile barrier kept Camille's anger contained beneath the cool surface of her composure. The doctor who entered a few minutes later was brisk but kind, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a voice softened by years of practice explaining bad news in gentle terms. He checked her bruising, asked standard questions about dizziness and vision, and, finding no signs of a concussion, offered her a mild painkiller and a recommendation to follow up if the swelling worsened. He was professional, efficient, treating her not as a judge or a victim or even a spectacle, but simply as a patient. And for that small mercy, Camille found herself quietly grateful. She declined the prescription, signing the necessary discharge forms with a steady hand, ignoring the sympathetic glance the nurse cast her way as she returned the clipboard. Sympathy was not what she needed. Sympathy would not undo the violence she had endured, nor would it strip Maddox of the uniform he had so thoroughly disgraced. When she finally stepped out into the hospital's main corridor, the late afternoon sun slanted through the wide glass windows, throwing long, fractured beams across the polished floor. She paused just inside the doorway, adjusting the strap of her briefcase against her shoulder, feeling the eyes of hospital staff and patients brush against her in cautious recognition. Her face was not unknown in this city. Federal judges, especially ones presiding over high-profile civil rights cases, tended to attract a certain level of public attention. But it was rare for that attention to come with such raw, unguarded shock. Let them look, she thought, lifting her chin and moving forward with the same steady stride she had carried into countless courtrooms. Let them see. Let them remember. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, indifferent to the wounds borne behind courthouse doors and hospital walls. Traffic snarled along the avenues, horns blaring in lazy frustration, pedestrians pressed across busy crosswalks, their lives marching on, untouched by the private battles waged in institutions meant to protect them. Camille stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the familiar press of the city around her, the pulse of its endless urgency, and allowed herself a single, deep breath, a centering, grounding act, before stepping toward the waiting black sedan, idling at the curb. Her clerk, Rachel, a sharp young woman in her late 20s with a mind like a scalpel, climbed quickly from the driver's seat, her face tight with worry. "Judge Rivers," she said, the title slipping automatically into place despite the informal setting. "Are you all right?" Camille gave a slight nod, though she saw the way Rachel's eyes flicked to the swelling on her face, the way her jaw tightened as if physically restraining herself from launching into a tirade on her behalf. "I'll live," Camille said, her tone dry but steady. "Let's go." Rachel hesitated only a second before moving to open the rear door, and Camille slid inside, settling against the seat as Rachel circled back to the driver's side. The door closed with a soft, final thud, sealing her away from the curious stares of the sidewalk, and for the first time since Maddox had thrown his punch, Camille allowed herself to exhale fully, the breath escaping her lungs with a quiet hiss she couldn't quite suppress. The car pulled into traffic smoothly, weaving through the congested streets with practiced ease. For a few long minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence thick, but not uncomfortable. A space for Camille to gather her thoughts, to feel the shape of the path now laid before her. She thought of the years she had spent swallowing small indignities in the name of professionalism, of the countless times she had smoothed over slights and insults, trusting that her work, her record, her very existence would be enough to change the spaces she entered. She thought of the warnings she had brushed aside, colleagues who advised her to keep her head down, mentors who reminded her that the higher she rose, the more careful she would have to be. And she thought of the look in Maddox's eyes when he struck her, the naked, unrepentant fury, the belief that he could destroy her without consequence simply because he wanted to. That was what she could not ignore. That was what she would not forgive. "Rachel," she said finally, her voice low but steady, drawing the younger woman's attention without pulling her eyes from the road. "I want a full file on Deputy Travis Maddox. Everything public, everything private, personnel records, complaint histories, disciplinary actions, even the ones sealed internally. If it exists, I want it." Rachel nodded sharply, her fingers already moving to tap notes into her phone. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice tight with the same controlled fury Camille felt boiling low in her own chest. "I'll have a report ready by morning." "Good," Camille said, settling deeper into the seat, feeling the ache along her jaw flare with each subtle bump in the road, but refusing to acknowledge it beyond a slight tightening of her hands in her lap. "We're going to do this by the book, every step, every procedure. No shortcuts, no favors." Rachel risked a glance at her then, quick but full of fire. "You're going to bury him." Camille allowed herself the smallest flicker of a smile, one without warmth, one forged from the iron certainty growing inside her. "No," she said, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, on the courthouse looming again in the distance like a promise waiting to be kept. "I'm going to expose him. And once the truth is laid bare, he'll bury himself." The car surged forward through a green light, and Camille leaned her head back against the seat, feeling the weight of the coming battle settle onto her shoulders like an old, familiar cloak. She was no stranger to hard fights, no stranger to long odds. This time, she would fight not just for herself, but for every voice silenced in hallways like the one where she had been struck, for every life ground under the weight of men who believed their power placed them beyond reach. And this time, she would not fight alone. The wheels turned beneath them, carrying her forward, not back to the safety of her chambers, not to retreat, but into the very heart of the reckoning she had decided, at last, to bring. The next morning broke colder than the forecast had promised, a thin sheet of gray cloud blanketing the city and pressing the light flat against the courthouse windows, making the building feel heavier somehow, more solemn. Camille stood at the far end of her chambers, hands clasped loosely behind her back, staring out over the skyline as the first staffers trickled in below, their heads bent against the chill, their breath rising in thin, hurried streams that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. She could still feel the ache along her jaw, the dull throb beneath her eye where the bruising had darkened overnight. But she pushed the sensation aside, compartmentalizing it the way she had learned to deal with 100 other indignities. Acknowledged, stored, moved past. There was work to be done, and pain, however sharp, was not an excuse to slow down. Behind her, the door clicked softly open and closed, and Rachel's brisk footsteps crossed the floor without hesitation. The young woman moved with an energy sharpened by purpose, a manila folder clutched tightly in her hand, her mouth set in a grim line that mirrored the mood hanging in the air between them. "Everything you asked for," Rachel said, offering the folder forward like a weapon. "And a few things I thought you'd want to see." Camille turned from the window and took the file without comment, her fingers moving with methodical precision as she flipped it open and scanned the contents. Complaint records, most dismissed quietly without formal investigation. internal memos flagging Maddox's behavior as aggressive and unsuitable for front-facing duties, warnings that had been ignored or buried, performance reviews riddled with vague language about conflict management issues that masked far deeper rot beneath the surface. It was worse than she had dared hope, and it was more than enough to begin. "Get legal affairs on the line," Camille said, her voice low but firm, the weight of command slipping into place with the ease of old armor. "Tell them I'm filing a formal misconduct complaint with the Federal Court Security Office. Full documentation, including witness statements, video evidence, and a sworn affidavit from myself." Rachel nodded without hesitation, already pulling her phone from her jacket, her thumb flying across the screen with practiced efficiency. Camille turned back to the file, marking sections mentally, cataloging the evidence she would need for the complaint, the affidavits she would demand from the attorneys and clerks who had witnessed everything firsthand. There would be no quiet internal review this time, no hushed apologies whispered over expensive lunches. This would be public. It would be official. And it would be devastating. Within the hour, the wheels were turning. Rachel moved between calls with the sharp focus of a battlefield medic, coordinating schedules, confirming meetings, drafting preliminary reports that would be vetted and signed before the day's end. Court administration offices buzzed with uneasy energy as word of Camille's actions began to circulate, whispered in hallways, carried in cautious emails exchanged beneath layers of polite euphemism. The courthouse was holding its breath again. Not in denial, but in anticipation. By noon, Camille had personally submitted the misconduct filing, handing it over to a stone-faced senior administrator whose hands trembled slightly as he accepted the folder, as if he could already feel the fire it would ignite. She signed the necessary affidavits without hesitation, the pen gliding smoothly over the paper, her name stark and undeniable at the bottom of every page. From there, she moved to the U.S. Attorney's office, stepping past security without a glance from the guards who now recognized her, not just as Judge Rivers, but as the woman who had made the whole building stop and stare less than 24 hours earlier. She met briefly with a federal prosecutor she trusted, laying out the situation without embellishment, providing copies of the evidence she had gathered, requesting and receiving assurance that an independent criminal investigation would be opened alongside the administrative proceedings. Justice would not come from a single direction. It would come from all sides at once, relentless and unavoidable. Returning to her chambers later that afternoon, Camille felt the first weight of exhaustion settle into her bones, not just the physical toll of the previous day's assault, but the heavier, grinding fatigue of knowing the battle ahead would be long and dirty and full of traps laid by those who would rather protect the system than fix it. She set the thick folder on her desk, smoothing her hand over the cover once, briefly, as if grounding herself against it, then sat down with a slow, deliberate grace that belied the ache threading through her muscles. Rachel entered a few minutes later, carrying a cup of tea instead of coffee, a small, silent acknowledgement of the tension coiled between fatigue and resolve. Camille accepted it with a nod, savoring the brief warmth against her palm, before setting it aside and pulling the first document toward her. "We'll need full witness statements by end of day tomorrow," she said without looking up, her voice steady, despite the crackling fatigue that whispered at the edges of her mind. "Affidavits, sworn and notarized. Chain of custody documentation for every piece of footage we submit. No gaps. No vulnerabilities." Rachel scribbled notes furiously, her pen scratching across her notepad like a quiet drumbeat of determination. "And the civil suit?" she asked, glancing up. Camille allowed herself the faintest smile, a cold, measured thing that did not reach her eyes. "We'll file by Friday," she said, tapping one fingertip lightly against the edge of the file. "Personal injury, civil rights violations, abuse of authority under color of law, punitive damages. And I want the suit structured so that any discovery effort opens the entire courthouse security office to scrutiny." Rachel's eyebrows lifted slightly, impressed despite herself, but she only nodded, flipping to a fresh page and scribbling down Camille's instructions. They worked well into the evening, the courthouse emptying around them as the sun bled out behind the city skyline, painting the windows in long streaks of dying gold. Lights switched off, one by one, in the offices across the hall. Shoes clicked away into silence, but Camille and Rachel remained, building their case piece by meticulous piece, brick by brick, wall by wall. By the time Camille finally leaned back in her chair, stretching the stiff muscles of her neck, she felt the structure solidifying around her. The inevitable, unstoppable force of truth, sharpened into a weapon no amount of institutional denial could deflect. She reached for her tea, now cold but still soothing in its own way, and allowed herself a single rare moment of reflection. Maddox had made the mistake of thinking her power lived in the robe she wore. He thought he could strip it away with a punch, with a badge, with the casual violence he had wielded for so long without fear of consequence. He was wrong. Her power lived in the law, in the truth, in the relentless, unbreakable fact of her own existence, and that was something he could never touch. And now, he would learn what it meant to challenge it. The days that followed moved with a gravity all their own, pulling people and truths toward Camille with the slow, relentless inevitability of a gathering storm. What had begun as a ripple of courthouse gossip, whispered and half-believed, quickly swelled into a tidal force as witnesses filed into her chambers, one after another, their voices low but growing stronger with each retelling. Some came timidly, eyes darting to the hallway as if still expecting retaliation from the uniformed men who once controlled these corridors without challenge. Others came with stiff-backed defiance, their anger barely masked beneath layers of brittle professionalism, their statements clipped and careful, but burning with the same quiet rage that fueled Camille's own resolve. Rachel kept the doors moving, managing schedules with an efficiency sharpened by urgency, ensuring that every statement was documented, signed, notarized, and secured within the growing mountain of evidence Camille was assembling. Every name added weight to the case, every affidavit another crack in the facade. Maddox and those like him had spent years building around themselves. But it was not only witnesses to Camille's assault who came forward. Word traveled further than she had anticipated, carried beyond the marble halls of the courthouse into the city itself, finding its way to those who had no formal stake in her case, but who bore scars of their own. Invisible wounds inflicted by the same hands, hidden by the same silences. The first was a woman in her early 40s, a public defender with a fierce reputation and a voice that barely trembled as she recounted an incident from 5 years earlier. A late evening filing, an empty security checkpoint, Maddox looming too close, his hand clamping down on her shoulder under the thin pretext of random inspection. She had reported it, filed the paperwork, trusted the process, but nothing had come of it. The file, she later learned, had been quietly closed, the investigation deemed inconclusive without so much as an interview. The next was a young black man, a law clerk whose trembling hands betrayed the lingering fear he had carried since Maddox cornered him near the parking garage 2 years prior, accusing him of trespassing despite the ID badge clipped plainly to his belt. He had been handcuffed, humiliated, paraded back through the courthouse before finally being released with a curt, unapologetic warning to watch himself. Each story peeled back another layer of rot, revealing a pattern too widespread, too consistent to dismiss as isolated misunderstandings or individual lapses in judgment. Camille compiled them methodically, refusing to let herself be swept up in anger or sorrow, treating each account as a brick laid firmly into the structure of the case she was building. A case not only against Maddox, but against the system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked for so long. By the end of the week, the file on her desk had tripled in size, thick with signed statements, copies of buried complaints, and internal memos unearthed through quiet favors and persistent digging. Rachel worked late each night, her youthful determination hardening into something sharper, more seasoned, as she sat across from Camille, parsing legal strategies and anticipating the inevitable counterattacks that would come. The courthouse itself seemed to shift under the weight of what was unfolding. Deputies who had once swaggered through the halls with casual entitlement now moved with a wary stiffness, their conversations quieter, their glances sharper. Senior administrators avoided Camille's gaze when they passed her in the corridors, their smiles brittle, their greetings hollow, as if proximity alone might implicate them in the reckoning they could no longer outrun. Even the judge's lounge, once a space of polite, guarded conversation, buzzed with uneasy energy. Some of her colleagues offered careful words of support, couched in the language of neutrality and due process, while others kept their distance, their faces shuttered, their loyalties weighed and measured against their own fear of the spotlight Camille had dragged into their once comfortable shadows. She accepted it all without bitterness. She had never expected this fight to earn her friends. Only change? On a rainy Thursday afternoon, just as the city dissolved into sheets of cold, slick gray outside her office windows, Rachel entered carrying another thick envelope, her expression grim but determined. "This came from an anonymous source," she said, setting the envelope carefully on Camille's desk. "I've had it scanned. No threats, no tampering. Just this." Camille opened it slowly, her fingers steady even as her pulse quickened. Inside were copies of sealed disciplinary files, ones she had suspected existed but had so far been unable to access through official channels. Reports of excessive force, formal reprimands for racially charged comments made during arrests, notations from internal affairs investigators flagging Maddox as a liability risk, recommended for reassignment to non-public duties, recommendations that had been quietly ignored or overridden by senior officials too lazy or too complicit to act. The dates stretched back nearly a decade. The pattern was unmistakable. The cover-up was undeniable. Camille leaned back in her chair, the weight of the evidence settling around her like a mantle. She had more than enough now to dismantle Maddox's career piece by piece, to rip away the thin veneer of respectability that had shielded him from consequences for years. But more importantly, she had the ammunition to force a wider reckoning, to expose not just the man, but the machine that had protected him. Rachel hovered nearby, waiting for instructions, her eyes shining with the sharp-edged hope that came from seeing the impossible finally shift toward the inevitable. "Draft a supplemental filing," Camille said, her voice calm but thrumming with power. "Add the sealed files. List every prior complaint, every internal recommendation that was ignored. Make it clear this isn't just about one man's misconduct. It's about institutional failure." Rachel nodded sharply, already turning away to begin the work. "And, Rachel," Camille added, her voice following her to the door, "send a copy to the office of the Inspector General. Off the record. Let them know it's coming, and that if it doesn't get addressed here, it will get addressed elsewhere." Rachel paused just long enough to meet Camille's gaze, a fierce smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Yes, Your Honor." The door swung shut behind her, and Camille turned back to the window, watching the rain carve long, trembling lines down the glass. Maddox had believed the system would shield him forever. He had been wrong, and now, with every passing day, every name added to the growing ledger of his crimes, the fortress he had hidden behind grew weaker, its foundations crumbling under the weight of the truth he could no longer outrun. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. The first media leak came on a Saturday morning, buried in the middle of a sluggish news cycle when few were paying attention, a calculated move meant to soften the blow before the full weight of Camille's case could come crashing down. A local tabloid website ran a headline dripping with insinuation, pairing Camille's name with words like altercation and incident. the article carefully avoiding outright lies while implying everything it could, that she had been the aggressor, that the situation had been more complicated than witnesses claimed, that perhaps she was not as dignified as her robe suggested. Camille read the article over her morning tea, her face blank, her heartbeat steady, even as the familiar sting of old battles whispered at the edges of her mind. It was not unexpected. Smear tactics were a common defense for men like Maddox. When you could not defend the act, you attacked the victim, muddied the water until truth and lie blurred together. By mid-morning, larger outlets picked up the story, some parroting the same vague insinuations, others offering more balanced coverage, but still seeding doubt with careful language. Alleged, purported. Sources say. Camille's office phone rang steadily all day, reporters fishing for quotes, for missteps, for any moment of emotion they could twist into headlines. Rachel fielded them all, her voice clipped and professional as she declined interviews, reiterated that all inquiries should be directed to the pending legal filings, and repeated, with unwavering precision, that Judge Rivers would not be making public statements at this time. Inside her chambers, Camille worked without pause, sifting through depositions, refining legal arguments, drafting letters to oversight bodies that would ensure the machinery of justice kept grinding forward, no matter how the public narrative tried to spin. Still, she felt the pressure rising, not just from the media, but from the subtle, quieter channels of institutional discomfort. Senior judges, their names whispered but never officially invoked, began reaching out indirectly, through staffers, through mutual acquaintances, expressing concern about the optics, about the disruption to the court's reputation, about whether there might be a more discreet resolution that could spare everyone further embarrassment. Camille received these overtures with the same cold, clinical detachment she applied to motions she knew she would deny. She owed these men and women nothing, not their comfort, not their silence, certainly not their protection. By Tuesday, a carefully worded editorial appeared in the city's largest paper, authored by a retired judge who spoke in solemn tones about the importance of decorum, of maintaining the dignity of the court, of avoiding prolonged public spectacles that could erode trust in our institution. The piece never mentioned Camille by name, but its target was clear to anyone who understood the game. Camille read it without reaction, then slid the newspaper aside and turned back to her work. She would not be shamed into surrender. Not now. Not when she was closer than ever to dismantling the shield that had protected men like Maddox for so long. The hearings on Maddox's administrative suspension began later that week, a closed-door proceeding meant to determine whether he would remain on payroll pending the outcome of the criminal and civil cases. Camille was not required to attend, but she sent Rachel armed with a thick packet of evidence, a silent message to the panel that she was watching, that the days of quiet cover-ups had ended. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Deputies stood straighter when they saw her, their greetings stiffer, their smiles thinner. Attorneys who once made small talk in the hallways now dropped their gazes, afraid of choosing sides too openly. Even her fellow judges, men and women who had once boasted of their commitment to justice over lunch and conference panels, now treaded carefully around her, offering strained smiles and hurried exits. But Camille walked through it all with the same deliberate grace, the same unbroken stride that had carried her through the assault, through the filings, through the media storm gathering outside the courthouse doors. She would not be moved. Not by gossip, not by pressure, not by fear, because she knew the truth. She carried it with her in every affidavit, every deposition, every grainy security camera still that captured Maddox's hand drawing back, captured the split second before violence stripped away any pretense he might have worn. The final blow came late Thursday afternoon, when Rachel burst into her chambers, a rare breach of decorum, her face flushed with barely contained triumph. "The suspension panel ruled," she said, almost breathless. "Maddox is out. Effective immediately. No pay, no benefits. Full termination pending the criminal investigation. Camille sat back slowly in her chair, the words settling into her chest with a slow, deep satisfaction that went beyond personal victory. This was not the end. Not yet, but it was the beginning of the end. The first pillar to fall in a structure that had seemed immovable for far too long. "Good," she said simply, her voice even, though inside her blood thrummed with a hard, clean rhythm of vindication. Rachel smiled fiercely, her hands tightening into fists at her sides as if she could barely contain the energy building between them. "And the U.S. Attorney's Office called," she added, nearly vibrating with contained excitement. "They're moving forward with criminal charges. Official announcement tomorrow morning." Camille allowed herself a long, steady breath, feeling the tension knotting her shoulders begin to loosen. Just slightly. Not relief, not yet. But progress, movement. Justice bending, slowly but surely, toward the light. "Start preparing the civil filings," Camille said, reaching for her pen, her hand steady as she uncapped it. "We won't wait for them to finish their side before we begin ours." Rachel nodded, already moving back toward her desk, her energy radiating outward like a second heartbeat thrumming alongside Camille's own. The courthouse might have hoped for silence, for shame, for retreat. Instead, it would get a reckoning, one deliberate step at a time. Outside the tall windows, the storm clouds that had loomed for days finally began to break. The first heavy drops of rain striking the glass in slow, measured beats. A drum roll for the confrontation still to come. And Camille Rivers, battered but unbowed, sharpened by every attack they had hurled against her, would be ready. The courthouse felt different as Camille moved through its wide marble corridors the next morning. A change too subtle to name, but impossible to miss. Where before there had been silence or sidelong glances, there was now a brittle tightness in the air, a sense that the old balance of power had shifted, tipping unevenly under the weight of everything that had been exposed. Staffers moved with a strained precision, their conversations clipped and cautious, their footsteps quickening when they passed her, as if proximity alone might draw unwanted attention. Even the portraits of long-retired judges that lined the main corridor seemed to loom heavier, their painted gazes watching her passage with the heavy disapproval of a tradition slowly unraveling at its seams. Camille walked steadily, her briefcase tucked neatly under her arm, her face composed into the cool, unreadable mask she had perfected over years of courtroom battles. The announcement from the U.S. Attorney's Office had gone public at sunrise, spilling across news outlets and social media within minutes. Deputy Travis Maddox, formally charged with assaulting a federal judge, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and several counts of falsifying official reports. The charges landed hard, a blunt force impact that no amount of spin could soften, and for the first time, the courthouse buzzed not with whispered skepticism about Camille, but with the frantic recalculations of men and women realizing that the old rules might not protect them after all. Rachel was waiting outside Camille's chambers when she arrived, her tablet already in hand, her expression taut with focus. "We've been served notice," she said, without preamble, falling into step beside Camille as they entered the office. "Maddox's attorney is filing a motion to dismiss the civil suit. Claims your actions provoked the incident, that you escalated the situation." Camille said nothing for a long moment, setting her briefcase down carefully on the desk before shrugging out of her coat, the movement smooth and unhurried, as if the world around her were not trying to reframe her own assault into an act of aggression. She had expected this tactic, had seen it deployed countless times against victims brave enough to stand their ground, and it only strengthened her resolve. "Let them file," she said finally, her voice low and certain. "We'll answer it line by line. Every lie they tell, we'll bury with evidence." Rachel nodded, flipping through her notes with quick, practiced fingers. "And the court date for the criminal arraignment is set. 2 weeks. They're trying to push for a delay, citing media prejudice, but I doubt the judge will grant it. Camille allowed herself a brief, grim smile at that. Prejudice, indeed. Prejudice that Maddox himself had courted for years without hesitation, now turned back on him with all the force he had once directed so casually at others. "Prepare the opposition filings," Camille said, settling into her chair and pulling a fresh legal pad toward her. "I want everything airtight. No room for mistakes." For the next several hours, the office hummed with focused energy. Papers spread across the long conference table, legal arguments crafted with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Witness affidavits were reviewed, security footage, timestamps cross-referenced, prior complaint records organized into clean, devastating exhibits that painted a picture no defense attorney could plausibly explain away. By late afternoon, Rachel appeared in the doorway again, a new tension pulling at her features. "Media's outside," she said quietly, camped out by the entrance. "They're asking for a statement." Camille glanced at the clock, noting the hour, the way the winter light outside had already begun to fade into a dull gray. She knew this moment would come, the point where silence would no longer be interpreted as dignity, but as weakness. She rose smoothly from her chair, straightening the simple black jacket she wore, and reached for the small stack of papers Rachel had prepared earlier that morning. "I'll give them one," she said. Rachel followed her through the quiet halls to the side entrance of the courthouse, where a tight knot of reporters and camera crews had gathered behind the barriers hastily erected by courthouse security. As Camille stepped into view, a low ripple ran through the crowd. Not the chaos of paparazzi chasing scandal, but something heavier, more expectant. Microphones lifted. Camera lights flickered to life. Camille walked to the small podium set up by the courthouse steps, placed the statement neatly in front of her, and met the eyes of the gathered press, with a gaze so steady it seemed to anchor the entire scene around her. "My name is Camille Rivers," she began, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard without the need for amplification. "I serve as a federal judge in this courthouse. Several days ago, while carrying out my duties, I was physically assaulted by a courthouse deputy. No embellishment, no dramatics, just the facts, delivered with the same precision she used to strip lies away from testimony in her courtroom. I have full faith in the process of justice that is now underway. I have filed civil action, and I am cooperating fully with the criminal investigation led by the U.S. Attorney's Office. I believe in accountability. I believe no one is above the law." The words fell into the cold air with the solidity of stone, and for a moment, even the reporters held their breath, sensing the weight of them. "I will not be commenting further at this time." "Thank you." She stepped back before the questions could start, pivoting smoothly and walking away from the podium, her stride unbroken, even as a dozen voices shouted after her, each desperate to pull more from her silence. But Camille gave them nothing more. She had said what needed saying. No more, no less. And now she would let her actions carry the truth forward. Inside, as the heavy doors closed behind her, Rachel let out a breath she had been holding and gave a small, fierce nod of approval. "Perfect," she said simply. Camille offered her a brief nod in return, but her mind was already turning ahead, already calculating the next moves, the next obstacles to be cleared. Maddox's arraignment loomed close now, the first true public confrontation since the day he struck her. And though the wheels of justice often turned slow and grinding, she intended to ensure they turned without mercy. The courthouse could not go back to what it had been. The system could not quietly absorb this scandal, bury it beneath paperwork and polite handshakes. Not this time. Not with her standing in the breach. The final reckoning was no longer a distant storm gathering on the horizon. It was here, pressing against the windows, hammering at the doors, ready to sweep away everything too weak to withstand the truth. And Camille Rivers would be standing at the center of it, unyielding until the very end. The courtroom held a different kind of silence that morning, a silence woven not from the ordinary tension of pending verdicts or sharp cross-examinations, but from the heavy, undeniable knowledge that something larger than any single case was about to unfold within its walls. The gallery filled early, packed with reporters, courthouse staff, and curious attorneys who had found reasons to linger nearby, their eyes flickering with the restless energy of witnesses awaiting a reckoning they had once believed would never come. Camille entered through the private access reserved for judicial officers, moving with the same deliberate calm she carried into every hearing, though today she wore no robe, no trappings of official authority, only the weight of her own resolve. She moved to the front row of the gallery, seating herself quietly behind the prosecution table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable as she laid a single legal pad across her lap, pen poised but unmoving. Across the room, at the defense table, Travis Maddox sat stiffly beside his attorney, his face a mask of bruised defiance. The clean, pressed suit he wore could not disguise the twitch in his jaw, the way his hands flexed restlessly against the table, nor could it conceal the exhaustion that had carved itself into the lines around his mouth and eyes. He looked smaller here, diminished under the high ceilings and heavy wood, stripped of the uniform that had once armored him against consequences. The presiding judge entered, and the room rose as one, the shuffle of feet and chairs filling the space before settling back into a tense, almost brittle quiet. Judge Ellery, a seasoned jurist known for his strict adherence to procedure and his aversion to theatrics, surveyed the room with a piercing gaze before signaling for the proceeding to begin. The clerk called the case, the formalities ticking forward in practiced rhythm. United States of America versus Travis Maddox. Charges read aloud, the words falling heavy into the charged air. Assault on a federal judge, civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, falsification of official reports. When asked how he pleaded, Maddox's voice barely carried across the room as he muttered, "Not guilty." His eyes locked not on the judge, not on the prosecutor, but on Camille herself, as if daring her to flinch under the weight of his hatred. She didn't move. She barely blinked. The prosecutor, a woman named Marissa Cole, rose from her seat with a quiet authority that filled the room as surely as any shouted argument might have. She laid out the government's position with calm precision, the facts of the assault, the overwhelming evidence of misconduct, the clear pattern of abuse documented over years of service. She spoke not in emotional appeals, but in cold, methodical statements, each one building on the last, layer by devastating layer, until Maddox's supposed innocence seemed not merely unlikely, but absurd. The defense responded with what little they had, insinuations that Camille had been confrontational, that Maddox had been forced into action by her behavior, that the situation had been chaotic and misunderstood. The arguments rang hollow, bouncing against the polished wood and stone like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. Through it all, Camille sat silent, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her expression carved from marble. She watched as her attackers' lies unraveled before the court, not with satisfaction, but with a steady, unrelenting patience. Justice was not a moment. It was a process, and she intended to see it through every grueling step. When the prosecution began introducing the video evidence, a hush fell over the room. The screens flickered to life, casting harsh light against the solemn faces of the audience. They saw it all: the initial confrontation at the elevator banks, the escalating aggression, the sharp crack of Maddox's fist against Camille's face, the way she staggered but did not fall, the immediate chaos that followed. There was no room for doubt anymore, no space for spin or reinterpretation. The footage ended, and the courtroom remained frozen for a long breath before Judge Ellery spoke. His voice grave. "The evidence is clear," he said. "The court finds sufficient cause to proceed to trial on all charges. Bail is denied." A low murmur swept through the gallery, quickly hushed by a stern glance from the bailiff. Maddox's attorney hissed something under his breath, but Maddox himself sat frozen, his face pale, his mouth working soundlessly as the weight of the court's judgment crashed down around him. Camille rose from her seat slowly, feeling the eyes of the room settle on her like a tide, not with pity, but with something deeper, respect, and perhaps a trace of fear for the kind of woman who could endure such violence and answer it not with rage, but with unwavering, implacable resolve. She gathered her things with deliberate care, pausing only once to glance across the aisle where Maddox sat crumbling beneath the consequences he had once believed he would never face. Their eyes met for a fleeting instant, and in that moment, Camille saw the full breadth of his defeat. Not just the loss of his badge or his freedom, but the crumbling of the identity he had built on the backs of those he thought powerless. And then she turned away, her stride steady, her back unbowed, moving once again through a world that could no longer deny what it had witnessed with its own eyes. Outside the courthouse, the rain had finally stopped, the sky cracking open to reveal a brittle blue threaded with streaks of fading gray. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting her name, hurling questions like missiles, but Camille moved past them without pause, her path clear, her purpose sharpened to a point so fine it could cut through anything. There was still work to be done, the civil case to prosecute, the deeper reforms to demand, but the first stone had been cast, the first pillar had fallen, and Camille Rivers would not stop until the walls that had sheltered injustice for so long lay broken at her feet. The trial began under heavy skies, the courthouse framed against a ceiling of low, bruised clouds that seemed to press down on the city with a slow, suffocating weight. Inside the building, security was tighter than usual, extra deputies stationed at every entrance, the tension in the air sharp enough to cut. Yet it was not fear that hummed through the halls, it was anticipation, a restless undercurrent of expectation that today, at long last, the courthouse would be forced to reckon with what it had allowed to fester in its own ranks. Camille entered the courtroom without ceremony, moving to her seat among the prosecution's witnesses, her head held high, her steps measured and unbroken. Across the aisle, Maddox sat at the defense table, his suit impeccable, his hair trimmed neatly, but there was no disguising the way his hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, or the way his jaw set rigidly against the proceedings he could no longer control. The judge presiding over the case, a visiting federal jurist from another district brought in to ensure impartiality, wasted no time in setting the tone. He read the charges aloud with an even, deliberate cadence. Assault on a federal judge, obstruction of justice, deprivation of civil rights under color of law. The words landed heavily, stripping away any pretense of misunderstanding or mistake. The prosecution opened with a simple, devastating statement, laying out the sequence of events in clean, unadorned terms. A deputy abusing his power, striking a sitting judge without cause, then attempting to cover his actions with lies and false reports. They presented the security footage, the witness testimonies, the disciplinary history long buried, but now dragged into the light. Each piece of evidence stacked atop the last, not rushed, not dramatized, simply placed with the methodical certainty of a case too strong to tear apart. Maddox's defense attorney fought hard, weaving a narrative of confusion, of provocation, of a good officer pushed beyond his limits by a situation spiraling out of control. He leaned heavily on coded language, suggesting, without ever saying outright, that Camille had somehow invited confrontation by refusing to show deference, by not complying quickly enough. But every argument, every strained justification withered beneath the mountain of evidence and the cold, steady reality of what the jury had seen with their own eyes. Camille was called to testify on the third day of trial. She rose without hesitation, moved to the stand with the same unflinching poise that had carried her through every step of this long, brutal fight. Under oath, she recounted the events without embellishment, her voice calm and unwavering, even as she described the moment Maddox struck her, the sharp explosion of pain, the stunned chaos that followed. The defense tried to rattle her, tried to twist her words, to paint her as combative, difficult, disrespectful to authority. But Camille met every insinuation with steady, unbroken truth, refusing to let them rewrite the reality she had lived through. When she stepped down from the stand, the room seemed to shift, the weight of her testimony settling heavily into every corner, leaving no doubt about who had acted with violence and who had stood with dignity. The trial moved swiftly after that. Witness after witness came forward, not just from the day of the assault, but from years past. Attorneys, clerks, public defenders, even a few former deputies, their voices threading together a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Maddox's anger, his abuse of authority, his unchecked aggression, all laid bare under oath, each account tightening the noose around his defense. Closing arguments came on a Friday afternoon, the courtroom packed beyond capacity, the air thick with a kind of charged expectancy. The prosecutor spoke first, her words measured but powerful, reminding the jury that no badge, no title, placed a man above the law he was sworn to uphold. She urged them to send a message, not just to Maddox, but to every institution that had looked the other way. The defense tried to salvage what little they could, appealing to sympathy, to doubt, to the fear that convicting an officer might weaken the thin line between order and chaos. But the arguments rang hollow, desperate echoes against the solid, brutal truth of what had been proven beyond question. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, their faces were grave, their movements deliberate. "Guilty!" the foreperson intoned, voice steady as she read the verdict for each charge. Guilty of assault on a federal judge, guilty of obstruction of justice, guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Each word fell like a stone into the silence of the courtroom, and with each word, the small, defiant flicker in Maddox's eyes guttered lower, until by the end, he sat slumped at the defense table, a broken figure stripped of the arrogance that had once filled every room he entered. Camille remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face composed, but inside she felt the slow, powerful roll of justice moving through her, not in a rush, not in a roar, but in a steady, unstoppable tide. The judge set sentencing for a later date, remanding Maddox into custody immediately, denying bail once again. Deputies, not the ones who had once flanked him in camaraderie, but others, colder now, professional and detached, approached and cuffed him without ceremony, guiding him from the courtroom as the gallery watched in silence. As the doors closed behind him, Camille rose slowly, gathering her things with deliberate care. Around her, the whispers began to rise, quiet at first, respectful. Not the gossip of idle scandal, but the murmured acknowledgement of a battle fought and won. Rachel was waiting outside the courtroom, her eyes bright, her smile fierce despite the professional calm she tried to maintain. "You did it," she said, her voice low but ringing with conviction. Camille shook her head once, a slow, measured gesture. "We did it," she corrected quietly. "And we're not done, because justice was not a single trial, a single verdict, a single broken man in handcuffs. Justice was a living thing, built moment by moment, stone by stone, against the forces that sought to erode it, and Camille Rivers intended to see it built stronger than ever before." The city outside waited, buzzing with the news, the verdict already rippling across headlines and news feeds. But Camille moved through it with the same calm, deliberate stride she had carried since the day this began. The system had tried to silence her, the system had tried to shame her, and she had answered it with truth, with law, with the unbreakable force of her own dignity, and she was just getting started. The days that followed the verdict moved quickly, but Camille met each one with the same steady, deliberate calm that had carried her through every step of the long fight. Travis Maddox remained in custody, his attorneys scrambling to negotiate a lighter sentence, their arguments battered before they even reached the judge's desk. The evidence was too overwhelming, the damage too public, the crime too grave for mercy to find footing. At sentencing, the courtroom was once again packed. The public and media gathered to witness the final chapter of a fall that had begun with a single brutal act and unraveled an entire career built on unchecked arrogance. Maddox stood stiffly between his attorneys, his expression carved into something hard and lifeless, offering no apology, no admission of guilt, only a hollow silence that the court met with appropriate disdain. The judge's sentence was clear and uncompromising. 5 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release, permanent revocation of his law enforcement credentials, and a public statement of findings detailing the full extent of his misconduct to be released to all federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read, the finality of it pressing down like the closing of a heavy door. Outside the criminal court, Camille's civil suit continued to grind forward with the same quiet, unstoppable momentum. With Maddox's conviction secured, his defense crumbled quickly, and within weeks, the courthouse administration, desperate to avoid a full public trial that would expose even more hidden rot, moved to settle. The terms were substantial: a 7-figure financial settlement, a full formal apology issued by the courthouse leadership, and, more importantly, a consent decree mandating sweeping reforms within the courthouse security division. Mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, anonymous complaint mechanisms, and the complete overhaul of hiring and disciplinary procedures were all secured, not as promises whispered in closed-door meetings, but as binding legal requirements enforced by federal monitors. For the first time in decades, the walls that had shielded bad officers from accountability were cracked open, forced into the light. Camille stood at the press conference, announcing the reforms, flanked not by politicians or courthouse administrators, but by the attorneys, clerks, and community members who had stood beside her, whose testimonies had made the difference between silence and systemic change. She spoke briefly, simply, refusing to bask in victory, but making clear that this was only the beginning. "Accountability is not the end of justice," she said, her voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "It is only its beginning." The city listened. The nation listened. In the months that followed, other stories began to surface. Deputies disciplined, supervisors forced out, long-ignored grievances finally taken seriously. The culture of impunity that had once ruled the courthouse began to erode, not with the suddenness of a collapse, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a foundation finally cracking under the truth. As for Travis Maddox, he disappeared into the cold machinery of the federal prison system, his name surfacing only occasionally in bitter local news editorials or whispered warnings in law enforcement circles about what happens when arrogance goes unchecked. He would serve his time, but the real punishment was already complete. He had been stripped not only of his badge and his freedom, but of the myth he had built around himself, exposed and discarded by the very system he had believed would protect him forever. Camille returned to her courtroom after the storm, resuming her docket with the same unshakable poise. But those who entered her courtroom now did so with a deeper respect, a sharper awareness that this judge would not be intimidated, that the law she served was not a shield for the powerful, but a sword for the wronged. She walked the halls of the courthouse without fear, without needing the silent acknowledgement of others, because she knew she had forced change not with anger or outrage alone, but with the slow, deliberate, relentless application of truth. The courthouse was different now, not perfect, not cured of every flaw, but changed. And that change Camille knew, would ripple outward in ways even she could not yet see. In the quiet of her chambers one evening, long after the reporters had packed away their cameras and the headlines had moved on, Camille stood at the window overlooking the city. The sky stretched wide and clear above the skyline, the sharp, clean light of early evening casting everything in a soft, golden haze. She sipped her tea slowly, feeling the lingering aches in her body, where bruises had long since faded, and allowed herself a rare, deep breath of satisfaction. Justice had been done. Not perfectly, not easily, but fully, and for once, the story would not be written by those who sought to bury it. It would be written by the woman who had lived it, fought for it, and won. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.